Shabbat Shalom. Shalom Aleichem. Welcome to BLT virtually again as we continue to study Torah, if not in person, at least allowing me and Rabbi Lori to share a few texts. So if you're new, feel free to jump right in and watch, and I imagine most of you watching are regulars and know that we like to begin with a blessing here at Congregation Micah. I'm Rabbi Flip. The blessing goes like this: Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We thank that power in the universe that commands us to busy ourselves with the sacred words of our tradition. And the word of the day is naso. You may be saying that's not so, but naso is the name of the Torah portion that we're studying. And it's a funky word. It's got a lot of meanings. It's got a weird root. The Torah portion itself begins Vayedaber Adonai el Moshe lemor. God speaks to Moses and says, Naso et rosh b'nei Gershon gamchem leveit avotam lemishpetotam. So it's get translated as take a census. Really count up the heads of the children of Gershon and their ancestral house by their families, their clans, mishpechotam. So the idea of taking a census, and you should take the census, the idea that everybody counts, that's a very important Micah principle I think we can all relate to. And just by way of introduction, I looked up, I'm screen sharing, what nasa is in its biblical dictionary way and how it's used throughout our tradition. Nashim, is the word for women. And I mention that because it's a similar root, but instead of it being a shin, it's a sin, the word nasa. And nasa means to lift up, to carry. And it's used in a variety of different ways. One cultural context, as I've said before, is that we lift the bride up, the woman, and carry her over the banister. But it's the word we find for Yisa Adonai, which is God lifts up his face in the priestly benediction, which we will take a look at and hear about more in our program today. Anyway, I just by way of introduction want to say that I'm missing you, and I'm missing being in person with all of you, and this is working for now, but sit back and join me and virtually everybody else as we study a few words of Torah. Welcome. We're back with a little brain candy. The title of this piece is called Soul Clocks, and it's from Floating Takes Faith by that guy I really like, Rabbi David Wolpe. Jewish events are notorious for starting late. Are you watching this on time or at your own leisure? The clock seems to move all too swiftly for people whose span is measured not in minutes, but in millennia. So we are leisurely about beginnings. The Zionist leader Nahum Goldman once said, "I tried my whole life to come late to a Jewish meeting. I never succeeded." Strangely, however, Jewish law depends on precision in the measurement of time. Sabbaths and holidays have specific starting times. Ritual observances such as mourning have definite time-bound cycles. We seem caught between the rigor of ritual and the languor of social occasions. Perhaps each clock counterbalances the other. Centuries of wandering did not always permit a fixed and insistent attitude toward time. Flexibility and patience are virtues cultivated by our uneasy history. Still, we did not allow tribulation to override obligation. For all the uncertainty in the world, there was certainty in our souls. Our spiritual clocks remain fine-tuned. Insistent on the rhythms of our own devotion, we have also made allowances for the unpredictability of circumstance. In other words, often it's a matter of finding parking. Well, it's not a matter of finding parking anymore because we do a lot of stuff all on our own time, which is okay, but then what makes the Sabbath unique? What makes it special? You've heard me say before that when the sun sets on Thursday or on Saturday, it probably isn't really that different from when it sets on Friday. But we as Jews say that it's different. There's something special about that time. And so even though we're virtual, there's a lot of stuff we do offer live, and it's important for that connection, both to be in person and live. And we'll do that again at some point in the future. So just a little something. Another piece of brain candy to warm up our thinking caps. This one's called A Dialogue Through Time. There was a time when little changed. People grew up in their same villages that their parents did. They knew the same people their whole lives. They did the same work, they ate the same food, and heard the same languages as their parents and grandparents. And today, we are constantly meeting new people, hearing new philosophies and ideas, meeting challenges posed by the shifting world around us. History has accelerated, and there's no turning back. Judaism has been struck by the same acceleration. New ideas and new philosophies have flooded this ancient faith. In this bewildering array, is there a bottom line? Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel once wrote an essay he called Toward an Understanding of Halakha, means law. It was subtitled Jewish Law as a Response. That is the bottom line. If Jewish tradition is a response to God, then it can flourish. If it's an arbitrary bunch of customs, it'll wither. But although Jews disagree about the history of our tradition, how it came to be and in what stage is it developed, one idea must endure. Judaism is a dialogue, not a human monologue addressed to an indifferent universe. We are all bound by the mitzvah of relationship to God, to other human beings, indeed, to all that God has created. All those relationships are touched by the changes in the world. But in each generation, in each new context, the ancient and blessed conversation, the dialogue that is Judaism, continues. I'm sorry this continues to be a monologue, and hope again that it will soon be a dialogue. We're looking at August. But until then, we know that our dialogue continues through the text and the voices we hear, and it's time to turn to that text and hear those voices. I'm going to begin this morning with a piece that was written by the great Rabbi Lori Rice about 5, 6, 7 years ago. Lori and I were asked to write for reformjudaism.org, and they do a real cool sort of 10 minutes of Torah. If you go to reformjudaism.org, you can sign up, and they'll send you weekly short interpretations written by rabbis. And so here's what Rabbi Lori Rice wrote at the time on Parashat Naso. Our ancient sages were obsessed with organization. As such, they categorized most everything, which is best reflected in the Talmud's 63 tractates, which addresses a variety of subjects, including Jewish ethics, philosophy, customs, history, lore, and much more. Nearly every topic has its place in order, with the exception of women. Women must have perplexed our dear rabbis. We can imagine the discussion. Are they women, or are they chattel? They bleed, but do not die. Yet they must be impure, but they create new life, something we certainly cannot do. And while there is indeed a tractate attributed to women, Nashim, from Naso, right, just the shin and the sin, we find ambiguity of women's roles in the Bible and within ancient Israelite society reflected in this inability to categorize women as one might the Jubilee year or the subject of Ketubot. The ritual of Sota, addressed in Parashat Naso, is an example of this ambiguity because of the linguistic difficulties that this riddle, this passage, provides us. Numbers chapter 5, verses 11 through 31 is what she's looking at. An accurate understanding of the details of the ritual and the motivation behind them may forever elude us, perhaps like the nature of women themselves. Adultery is considered a very grave offense in the Torah, much in the same way that incest is a sin punishable by death. See Leviticus chapter 20, verses 10 through 12. Unlike the laws of incest, which apply to both men and women, Leviticus, again, chapter 18, right before the Holiness Code in 19. In the case of adultery, there is a fundamental difference between men and women. A married woman is forbidden to have sexual relations with all men except her husband. But a married man is free to have sexual relations with any other woman as long as she herself is single and available. Since biblical law allows men concubines as well as wives, there's no punitive measures against a man who engages in extramarital sex. Even when the Babylonian Talmud attempts to prohibit a man from spending time in privacy with women outside of his family, that's Kiddushin, pages 80b and 81b, such relations still remain outside the purview of sexual transgressions. The Bible recognizes that adultery is ambiguous because the very act requires privacy, often with no witnesses or proof, but suspicion of adultery is easily aroused and quickly spread. Two possible scenarios are offered by our Torah text. The first is a case of a woman who has committed adultery and has kept it secret from her husband, although he suspects it. And the second is of a husband who suspects his wife of committing adultery, though she is indeed innocent. In both cases, the common thread is the husband's jealousy and suspicion. Parashat Naso describes the punishment by ordeal for any woman accused of adultery, a test in which divine judgment determines the guilt or innocence of the suspected wife. The suspected woman is to be brought before the sanctuary priest. He will uncover her head and ask her to place her hands upon the altar of the meal offering. He's then to prepare a mixture of water, earth, and ashes from the meal offering. This mixture, known as the waters of bitterness, is meant to induce a trance. The priest will then say to her, "If no man has lain with you, if you have not gone astray while married to your husband, be immune to harm from this water of bitterness. But if you have gone astray while married to your husband and have defiled yourself, may the Eternal make you a curse, as the Eternal causes your thigh to sag and your belly to distend." Here in Numbers 5, verses 19 through 21. The precise meaning of expression, waters of bitterness, eludes translators, and alternative translations have been offered. Waters of blessing, waters of contention, waters of revelation. As students of Torah, we ask, why this ritual? One possibility is that it's not really the actual physical test that matters, but rather the devastating psychological reaction to the frightening and humiliating experience. A woman is brought before the priest. Her hair is uncovered. She's forced to drink a concoction that, by comparison, makes mivushal wine seem alluring. We'll discuss that maybe another time. The reasoning behind this test may have been that the psychological impact would be so great, the humiliation so severe, that a woman with a guilty conscience would reveal her guilt one way or the other. Another read is that the ambiguous nature of the ritual is intended in order to practically guarantee that a woman could prove her innocence. Perhaps the ritual afforded a way for women to clear themselves of suspicion. One might imagine that the Torah would say that a man who has sexual relations with a married woman has, in effect, taken what belongs to another man. In such a case of the sotah, however, it is the woman, not her lover, who is accused of the crime of ma'al, of misappropriation of property. The errant wife has taken something belonging to her husband, perhaps his honor, her fidelity, or the exclusive rights to her sexuality. And therefore, the subject of this section of Torah is not her adultery, but rather his jealousy and pride. After all, the ritual is enacted when a man feels suspicious. Rabbi Sarah Levine points out that this societal problem of men's jealousy is marked onto the bodies of women, the true abhorrence here, much in the same way that men's legislation of a woman's body is equally disturbing in today's public and legal arena. Perhaps the ambiguity in the text is the Torah's own way of withholding support for the husband's lack of control of his emotions, or even condemning the misplaced blame. The uncertainty of the text just may be the Torah's way of saying, men, pull yourselves together. Stop blaming women for your shortcomings. We can even imagine the tone she might take when offering such a tochacha, constructive criticism. So, just so you know, mivushal wine is wine that has been treated so that it is kosher to drink, no matter who handles it. Because some people won't drink wine if not Jewish people handle it. So we've been offering, or I've been offering, what's called a devar acher, and that's just sort of another idea on the idea, another matter And sometimes that's done in dialogue with ancient texts, and sometimes that's done in a contemporary way between rabbis. And now it's done on Zoom. So this Devar Acher is by Danny Berkman. He writes, Sota, how far have we come? How far do we still have to go? He writes, whenever I read about the Sota, I cannot help but think about the scene of the witch trial in Monty Python and the Holy Grail. The scene makes a mockery of the peasants calling for the woman to be burned as a witch, despite no real evidence, and the knight who's responsible for administering what passes for a judicial verdict in that context. While I'd like to think that the ritual in the temple was more civilized and orderly than the one presented in the movie, I wonder how far apart they really are from one another. It seems clear that the ritual of Sota and the trial of witches were both ways by which men sought to control women in their society. As we read the account of the Sota, it's clear that the men are the active participants in the ritual, with everything done to the woman by her husband and the priest. Thankfully, we no longer have witch trials, and we no longer practice the ritual of Sota, but we might wonder about other ways in which our overwhelmingly male-dominated society continues to seek control of women. Over the last few years, authors like Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In, has gotten a lot of media attention, highlighting many of the challenges for women seeking to combine a career and a family life. What comes across loud and clear through this book is that men and women are judged differently, held to different standards, and that society's generally accepted career paths for men significantly over women. As she writes, the promise of equality is not the same as true equality. Despite all the progress toward equality in modern society, we can still see ways in which men seek to control women, especially in the professional arena. Women with children have to choose whether to be stay-at-home moms or working mothers, and there's no equivalent in male language because no similar dichotomy is presented to men. In the case of the Sota, as Rabbi Lori Rice makes clear, it's the husband's suspicion and jealousy that leads to the ritual's enactments. In this way, it's a reminder for us that the quest for true equality is not a women's issue. It's an issue for all of us who are concerned with building a fair and equal society. As we read about the Sota, it's a reminder of how far we have come, but also how far we still have to go. I want to be a working father in partnership with my wife as we build a family and careers together. Rabbi Berkman is a rabbi, or was, at the Community Synagogue in Port Washington, New York. So, a couple of looks at the Sota, all pre hashtag #MeToo, and all addressing an ancient, really misogynist culture. But we'll hear some other insightful pieces of the Torah next. I'm reading from Numbers chapter 6, in verse 22. V'adaber Adonai el Moshe lemor. God speaks to Moses and says, Daber el Aharon ve'el banav. Speak to Aaron and to his children, lemor, saying, Kol tivarachu et bnei Israel. Thus you shall bless the children of Israel. Amor lachem. Say this to them. Yivarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha. May God bless you and protect you. Yisa Adonai panav alecha v'yichunecha, may God deal kindly with you and sort of graciously with you. Yisa Adonai panav alecha v'yasem lecha shalom, and may God bestow His favor upon you, lift His face to you, and grant you peace. V'samu et shmi al bnei Yisrael v'ani avrachem. Thus they shall link my name with the children of Israel, and I'll bless them. Okay, so that's the text that we're going to pick apart a little bit right now in a couple of different ways. What I read for you is often called the priestly benediction. You've probably heard it. Maybe you've given it a lot or little thought. I don't know. It's really at the heart of what we, as Jews, wish for. It is, in a sense, the way that God is, draped over us. And this is the way God blesses us, not with words, but with the realities toward which these words point. So let's investigate these realities a little bit. Number one is the God and bless you part. The word in Hebrew we know is Baruch, Baruch Atah Adonai. Berech, maybe, same root, comes from the knee. A lot of theologians suggest that there's humility in bending the knee. Like with Baruchu, when we bow. Bending the knee is a sign of humility. And so we move closer to the earth. In doing so, we become more human. We do not bless by standing above others. Rather, we bless by reaching out to others. Without the pride. And when God blesses us, we're supposed to be humbled. And we're supposed to be vulnerable. And it's why we need to be protected, I think. So in the first part of the benediction, blessing and protection sort of come together. Absolute vulnerability and ultimate strength. Part 2. May God's face shine upon you, be gracious to you, we like to say. Grace is sort of God's face shining upon us and in us. I know the light kind of is catching that part of mine. So maybe that's what it is. That's the grace. According to Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, it refers to the level of knowing that reveals our unique purpose in the world. Knowing why you were born is the ultimate grace. It's from this knowing that you make sense of your past and that you can set a future on track. And it's why the blessing actually, grammatically, I think, occurs in the future tense. I often translate this, if you've heard me, as make you smile. The word hinuch there also is connected to the idea of smiling. And it's so facial. And if we translate it just as grace, we list that, may God's face be lifted to you, which is really the third part. And that is the ultimate sort of encounter, a relationship with God, a personal one, a vulnerable one. And in this relationship, we are the beloved by God. And in this intimacy, there's a peace that is experienced, a wholeness, certainly, a shalom that is intended with divinity. That last line you may not recognize, they shall, my name in the children of Israel idea, the name of God is the essence of God, essentially. And it's why we don't know how to pronounce it correctly. It is God's actual being, is his name. And the mystics say that each of us have the power to discover that we are God manifest in our own particular time and place. We literally become, or better, we realize that we have always had the potential to be a name of God, an animation of God's energy. And finally, I shall bless them. Here, God is making clear that it's God, Adonai. It's not the priests that are doing the blessing. It's not the rabbi. We may vocalize the text, but the meaning is from, the meat of it. It's from Adonai. And Rabbi Rami Shapiro taught me some of these interpretations around this. We've discussed this text, and he likes to translate it like this. He says, may God awaken you to your true holy nature. May God reveal to you your place and purpose. And may God become loved and beloved. And in God, may you find wholeness and peace. May you realize your innermost being as the presence of God. And in this way, know that you're blessed and be called to bless. So I like that because in my work as a rabbi, I've been charged with the obligation of blessing other people. And for a long time, I didn't really understand what that was. And I now know there's no greater blessing than this priestly benediction. So learn it. It's not long. You can learn the Hebrew too, so that you can bless others who need it with such grace and with such shalom, such peace. And in that way, we really all become a kingdom of priests and a holy people. It's not just us on rabbis. So let's stay tuned for Devar Acher. All right, some other thoughts on the priestly benediction from our Torah portion this week, Parashat Naso. It contains, this ancient blessing known to humankind as the priestly benediction, and the Yisa part of it, Yisa Adonai panav alecha v'yasem lecha shalom. The Yisa is from the same root as Naso. It doesn't sound like it because the Yud is a Y sound and the Nun is an N sound, but the Yud, the Nun nafla, I don't know how to say it, the Nun falls off sometimes in the root. And so it's kind of a strange word, as I mentioned at the beginning of our session today. It's got a level of intimacy to it, as a blessing should. So I got to thinking about how our community at Congregation Micah has really always been blessed in a lot of ways. Even during this pandemic time, even given the threats to Jewish life, we've been blessed. Listen, I've had a roof leak before. I've never gone through a tornado where my roof was lipped off, so I feel blessed by that, and especially in this town. But things happen in life, and in the hopes that you too will find blessings, I wanted to share some thoughts of some things that have occurred in some strange places. Everything in creation has a purpose according to certain rabbinic thoughts. I'm thinking Ed Feinstein, for instance, in Los Angeles, California. He's a rabbi, Valley Beth Shalom congregation that I like a lot, and he tells great stories. He teaches. He reads from the Midrash that everything has a purpose in creation. So he once said that he caught his wife, subscribing to People magazine, and he was sort of left to wonder, like, what is the purpose of this in God's universe? It seems to provide no blessings, right? It's the epitome of culture light. It's got gossipy articles, and it's about the rich and the famous and the celebrated and the actors and actresses. And through this People magazine, you can see dazzling photos and read revealing interviews and inspiring stories about the dramas of love and marriage and divorce and diet. And all of these things are in the Torah. So really, does anyone need to spend money on this, on People magazine? And People is not an isolated phenomenon, right? There's an entire industry of gossip and celebrity worship. And, follow any social media, right? Anyway, having known of the existence and glanced at People magazine myself, I do notice that, some cynicism might have been premature. Turns out that People actually does have a purpose under heaven, a worthy moral purpose. It blesses us. It tells us the story of the rich and the beautiful and the famous, and thoroughly describes how miserable they are. Broken marriages and failed relationships and drug abuse and alcoholism and talent squandered and fortunes and families lost through narcissistic excess and suicide not just of body but of spirit. It's all in the pages of People, and it's almost as dramatic as the Torah. Here are the 50 most beautiful people, those who have it all: unlimited wealth, fame, sexual magnetism, their homes and cars and svelte bodies we all dream about, and their lives. Their lives are so empty, so lonely, so pointless, so desperate. In ein kemach, ein Torah. Without sustenance, teaches Pirkei Avot, there is no Torah. Yeah, it's a teaching that is frequently used when we come to you to ask for contributions to support education, or like a Children's Academy, or scholarships, or programs that engage young and old in learning and ancient wisdoms of our tradition. There's a second, more profound line to that teaching. In ein Torah, ein kemach. Without Torah, there's no sustenance. It works both ways. This is the moral lesson of the blessings of People magazine. All that wealth, all that talent, all that charisma, all that beauty, all that our culture worships and envies as the goals and the ideals of existence, so futile, so barren, so void, so utterly wasted in a life without moral vision or spiritual wisdom or transcendent purpose. Our Torah portion this week offers more than an ancient blessing. We are shown an alternative vision in the form of a powerful image of life and its meaning. At Mount Sinai, the Israelites constructed a shrine, a tabernacle. Sounds better in Hebrew, I think. Mishkan. Yeah. The title of our prayer books, right? Mishkan Tefillah, the dwelling place of our prayer, the Shekinah. The Mishkan was a dwelling place for God, God's presence, a connection place between heaven and earth. Preparing now to leave Sinai and continue the journey toward the Promised Land. Our Torah portion this week provides instructions for dismantling and transporting the Mishkan. Each Levitical family is assigned responsibility for a part. Right? The objects themselves were common. A board, a rod, a section of curtain. What glory, what satisfaction was there in schlepping a heavy fence post, a bulky tapestry through the hot desert day after day, mile after mile. It was only when the march stopped and the whole was assembled that each individual could soon recognize the meaning of his or her burden. Only then could they see the critical purpose that board, like our board, pun intended, that rod, that post, that section of tapestry, that it all held together a making of a place, a tabernacle, the Mishkan, for God on earth. The burdens we bear day to day have little in common, I think, with the lives of the rich and the beautiful. Struggling to survive this pandemic and make sure we have the economic capacity to feed our families, continuing to raise healthy children and educate them, working to provide and share in the joys of our community. All these things we've experienced recently. Not the stuff of People magazine. The real stuff of us people ourselves. It's in bearing these decidedly unglamorous and uncelebrated burdens that real heroism, real beauty, real meaning, real blessings are found. And maybe, once in a while, we do get to see the whole picture. The wholly critical purpose of our own struggles in making this place at Micah a place that God might want to dwell. And if you can do it, whether you read People or Torah, whether you live with people or Torah, if you can do it, if we can do it, then I am quite certain that God will naso, will lift up God's face and shine it upon us, and we'll feel that blessing. I've told this story before, but some time ago, archaeologists in Israel were excavating outside the walls of Jerusalem, and they got to a place called Gay Ben Hinnom. Gay means valley, and there's some evidence that this is the valley of the site of a pagan cult who worship God with human sacrifices, especially of children. So, given the story of Abraham, the Jewish tradition started to call Gehinnom, it was the word they used for hell. And these archaeologists had discovered something of great historical significance. They came upon these two amulets, these two silver amulets, silver scrolls, really small. They were crusted with dirt and corrosion. They had been rolled shut for 2,600 years. And they worked patiently, and these specialists managed to open them up and to clean them. And they discovered a barely legible inscription, a very famous passage from our Torah. It contained the priestly benediction, this threefold blessing, which somehow we like to say now, survived in and through hell. It's a sign of hope, I think, for all of the people who ever lived near that valley. It's hope that stretches out across mountains and valleys and oceans and time to bless us now, in this time. It's a blessing you've been watching. Thank you. With all the civil unrest that's been going on, I thought I would conclude Parashat No's Torah study portion with a sermon I gave several years ago, but might still really work. It goes like this. I had the opportunity once to hear Tom Brokaw speak, which maybe doesn't sound so impressive because most of us had that opportunity because he was on TV. But I saw him in person. And he spoke about the famous series of books, The Greatest Generation. And he spoke with passion and great awe about the accomplishments of these humble and sometimes unsung heroes of the World War II era. He spoke of them individually, telling stories of heroism on the battlefields of Europe and in the South Pacific. It was simply beyond even Hollywood's best attempts to recapture. He told stories of men who saved buddies by rushing through hailstorms of bullets and shrapnel, who sacrificed life and limb for small parcels of land that they could only trust were strategically important. He spoke of incredible heroism, the sense of duty and of self-sacrifice on the home front as well. The rubber drives, the victory gardens of industry, of a sense of community. It was not perfect or complete, but transcended many historical social barriers and transformed our nation in profound ways. Individually, the stories are almost unbelievable. Even if we allow the glorification of acts and deeds that is part of our history, the tales he told were of heroes and heroines that send chills down the spine, make one sort of well up for pride in being an American, and certainly brought people to tears. The true greatness of the greatest generation is when their incredible individual accomplishments are taken collectively. When we remember that, like us, they are simply a group of people born at a certain time, shaped by events and circumstances far beyond their control. Hardened by the Great Depression, industrious and determined to overcome obstacles, deeply rooted in faith and belief. That was a generation that answered the call. That was a generation that ensured the blessing of liberty for the next generation. It's not too verbose to say that were it not for them standing up to tyranny, meeting the incredible challenges facing the world at that time, we wouldn't be here today, in a free country, part of a community, a holy congregation, Congregation Micah. What they did and the incredible sacrifices they made changed the world. And they changed for the better. They made the world, and even this moment, possible. So as we read Parashat Naso, with Jews all over the world, the second Torah portion in the book of Numbers, in which we call in Hebrew Bamidbar, or in the desert, is named that because the entire book takes place in the desert, as Jews march from slavery in Egypt to hope and freedom in the biblical Israel. And the Torah portion Naso speaks of the greatest generation, not in America, but rather in Jewish history. In Hebrew, we call them Bador Bamidbar, right? The generation of the desert. And while there have been many great generations in Jewish history, it was the generation of the desert that most clearly matches the sacrifice, I think, the heroism and transformative effect upon future generations, like the one that Tom Brokaw helps define. Picture it. Egypt lay in ruins. Pharaoh's army and all his chariots lie at the bottom of the Red Sea. The band of 600,000 plus Israelites totally unprepared for the perils and challenges of camping. The things that lay ahead, yeah. They've been slaves in a land, enduring hardships and toil of literally biblical proportions. They've lost their way. They've lost their connection. And for many, their faith and belief in God. And yet, at this moment in freedom, they come to believe again led by the greatest leader of any generation, a Lincoln, a Roosevelt, Churchill, Eisenhower, all rolled up in one. Moses leads his people through a 40-year struggle with the desert itself, with opposing armies, ultimately with the people themselves, their inner souls, and what God is asking of them. They too have been shaped and prepared for this by their experiences as slaves, their own Great Depression. They know hard work. They know the challenges of holding on to ideas and convictions when the whole world around them is abandoning those beliefs. They embark on their great journey, a battle really with the forces that are evil internally in addition to externally. And they had individuals who put self ahead of community. They had setbacks. They had doubts. They're plagued by infighting, by turmoil. They're tested by God and by each other. Ultimately, the generation of the desert doesn't live to see the fruits of their own sacrifices. The world they create, the promised land they secure and inhabit is not for them. It's for their children to inherit. Yet we say of them, as we can say of those of the World War II era, of the post-Holocaust era, someday of the post-pandemic era. Yeah, we can say that if it were not for them and their struggles and sacrifices, we would not be here today. Had they not maintained their faith and their convictions in the face of overwhelming forces to the contrary, Judaism would not have endured. The story of our people would be wholly different. For this generation, we need to continue the battle and the struggle against external enemies, against internal self-doubt, against perceived limitations. Because in the face of these struggles, it often takes a leader or leaders to buck up the troops, to restore pride and conviction and hope. The generation of the desert had Moses, Aaron, the high priest, to inspire him. And in this week's parashah, we have the famous words of Aaron, right? The priestly benediction again. A blessing given by the high priest to the whole community of Israel. We can imagine in our mind's eye the high priest looking out over the multitudes. They've been through so much at this point in the story that the greatest challenges lies ahead. And with that context, Aaron the high priest, with Moses, his brother, by his side, speaks the holy words of the blessing. May God bless you and keep you. May God's face shine upon you and be gracious to you. And may God's countenance shine upon you and through you. And may you be granted peace. An echo of those sentiments, that same beseeching of God for blessing, it ripples down the generations. We can hear it in the words of President Roosevelt, who offered this 60 years ago as the Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy. Almighty God, our sons, pride of our nation, this day have set upon a mighty endeavor to set free a suffering humanity. Lead them straight and true. Give strength to their arms, stoutness to their hearts, steadfastness to their faith. They will need thy blessings. For men's souls will be shaken with the violence of war. They fight not for the lust of conquest. They fight to end conquest. They fight to liberate. They fight to let justice arise, and for tolerance and goodwill among all thy people. They yearn but for the end of battle, for their return to the haven of home. Some will never return. Embrace these, Father, and receive them, thy heroic acts, into thy kingdom. And for us at home, fathers, mothers, children, wives, sisters, and brothers of brave men overseas, whose thoughts and prayers are ever with them, help us, Almighty God, to rededicate ourselves in renewed faith in thee in this hour of great sacrifice. Jewish and American history teach us that it takes three things to have the making of a great generation. It takes a generation who understands what it means to sacrifice, one that's willing to endure hardship for the greater good, one that sees beyond their own immediate needs and pleasures and security and envisions a greater purpose, a greater calling, a greater sense of duty to those generations that are yet to come. Secondly, it takes great leaders, people who are able to inspire through words, through deeds, and who can channel the blessings of history upon the good and noble works of our current struggles. And finally, it takes a cause, a purpose that's inherently noble, something that's holy and worthy of God's blessing. Yeah. I believe that this generation, this next generation, will learn the importance of sacrifice. I pray that each of us and all alive, in our own ways, will learn to be great leaders, inspiring in word and in deed. And I hope, with all my heart, that our soldiers in battle in distant lands, ideologically and socially here at home, that we find a clarity of purpose in that, so that future generations might know a time of peace. Shabbat Shalom, and thank you for joining me.